Security specialist Marcus Vale had protected diplomats in 12 different hostile environments, but nothing in his military training had prepared him for the political complexity of the Arcturus Peace Summit. The neutral station Concordia housed representatives from 12 species, each with their own ideas about territorial rights, defensive necessities, and the basic question of whether peace was possible when everyone wanted the same strategic star systems. Your primary assignment is Ambassador Kira Velthani of the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps, briefed Commander Sarah Chen, activating holographic displays that showed the station's layout and security protocols. She's the primary architect of the shared governance proposal that might actually prevent this territorial dispute from becoming a shooting war. Marcus studied the ambassador's file, noting her impressive diplomatic record and the particular challenges that came with protecting someone whose species had complex honor codes he was still learning to navigate. Any specific threats I should know about? About 6 different factions would prefer that her peace proposal never sees implementation, Chen replied grimly. The hegemony's military wing thinks shared governance is weakness that invites aggression. The Merchant Coalition believes joint administration will disrupt profitable trade routes. And there are at least 3 extremist groups that view the entire peace process as surrender to enemy interests. Marcus absorbed this information while reviewing station schematics and evacuation routes. Concordia was designed as a neutral meeting space, but its civilian-focused architecture made security challenging when political tensions ran high. The ambassador's schedule is ambitious, Chen continued, highlighting the diplomatic agenda. Formal sessions, informal consultations, private meetings with faction leaders, public appearances designed to build support for the peace process. She refuses to let security concerns limit her diplomatic activities. That's going to make protection complicated, Marcus observed. That's why you're here. Your job is to keep her alive long enough to either achieve peace or fail honestly in the attempt. Marcus's first meeting with Ambassador Kira Velthani took place in the Zephyrian delegation's quarters, a space decorated with crystalline art that seemed to sing when touched by the station's artificial lighting. The ambassador herself was exactly as impressive as her file suggested. Tall and graceful with the characteristic pointed ears that marked her species, silver-streaked dark hair arranged in a style that incorporated what appeared to be living crystals, and amber eyes that held depth suggesting both intelligence and determination. Specialist Vale, she said, rising from a desk covered with diplomatic documents, I understand you'll be responsible for my security during these negotiations. Yes, ma'am. I've reviewed the threat assessments and prepared security protocols that should allow you to conduct your diplomatic activities while minimizing risk exposure. Ambassador Kira's expression suggested polite skepticism. And these protocols involve limiting my access to other delegations? They involve managing your interactions in ways that provide maximum security coverage, Marcus replied carefully. The informal consultations you've scheduled could be conducted in more secure settings with minimal impact on their effectiveness. Specialist Vale, informal consultations work precisely because they're informal. Moving them to secure facilities changes their entire character and defeats their diplomatic purpose. Her tone was patient but firm. I appreciate your security concerns, but I won't allow fear to paralyze the peace process. Marcus found himself caught between professional duty and respect for someone whose commitment to peace was clearly genuine. Ma'am, the intelligence reports suggest coordinated opposition to these negotiations. Multiple groups are actively working to ensure they fail, and several have identified you as a key target. I understand the risks, Ambassador Kira said, moving to the windows that showed Concordia's central plaza where representatives from multiple species mingled in carefully supervised social interactions. But the alternative to these negotiations is a territorial war that could destabilize this entire sector. Millions of lives depend on whether we can find common ground. Which is why keeping you alive is so important, Marcus pointed out. Ambassador Kira smiled, the expression transforming her face from diplomatically composed to genuinely warm. Specialist Vale, I've spent my career building consensus among beings who often prefer conflict to compromise. I understand calculated risks, and I understand the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. Over the following days, Marcus began to appreciate both the complexity of the peace negotiations and Ambassador Kira's remarkable skill at finding solutions that addressed underlying concerns rather than just surface demands. During security briefings, she would explain the various delegations' positions with insights that helped Marcus understand motivations that weren't obvious from intelligence reports. The hegemony's aggressive stance isn't about conquest, she explained during one of their planning sessions. They're genuinely afraid that shared governance will leave them vulnerable to species that might exploit cooperative frameworks for competitive advantage. So they prefer conflict because it's more predictable than cooperation? Marcus asked. They prefer control because they understand it, Ambassador Kira corrected. Our challenge is demonstrating that shared control can provide better security than exclusive control, but that requires trust they're not prepared to offer. Marcus watched her work with growing admiration for both her diplomatic skill and her genuine commitment to solutions that served everyone's interests. During informal consultations, she would listen to each delegation's concerns with the kind of focused attention that made them feel heard, then find connections between seemingly incompatible positions that created possibilities for compromise. You're good at this, he observed after watching her mediate a particularly heated exchange between the Altarian trade representatives and the Citani military advisors. I have to be, she replied simply. The alternative is watching species destroy each other over resources that could be shared productively if they could overcome their fear of cooperation. But as the negotiations progressed, Marcus's security concerns deepened. Intelligence reports suggested that opposition to the peace process was organizing beyond official diplomatic channels. Extremist factions from multiple species were reportedly coordinating efforts to disrupt the summit through direct action, viewing successful peace agreements as threats to their respective political or economic interests. The threat level is escalating, Marcus reported during their daily security briefing. We're seeing increased communication between groups that normally don't cooperate, suggesting coordinated planning for some kind of direct intervention. Ambassador Kira reviewed the intelligence summaries with obvious concern, but her response remained consistent with her previous positions. Specialist Vale, I understand that your job is to keep me safe, but my job is to build peace. I can't do that from inside a bunker. Ma'am, I'm not suggesting you hide from the negotiations. I'm suggesting we modify your schedule to reduce exposure to unnecessary risks. Define unnecessary, she challenged. Marcus found himself struggling to articulate security concerns that might sound like paranoia to someone whose entire career was built on taking calculated risks for diplomatic purposes. The private consultation with the neutral mediator scheduled for tomorrow. My sources suggest it might be a setup to isolate you from security protection. Ambassador Kira studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes reflecting something that might have been appreciation for his concern mixed with determination to continue her diplomatic mission. Specialist Vale, if I withdraw from every meeting that might be dangerous, I withdraw from the peace process entirely. And if I do that, people die. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the territorial conflicts that will follow when diplomacy fails. Marcus understood her logic, but his training and instincts were screaming warnings about the convergence of threats that intelligence was detecting. Ma'am, I just want to make sure you live long enough to see whether your peace proposals actually work. Then do your job, specialist, she said with a smile that managed to be both challenging and reassuring. Keep me alive while I do mine. The breakthrough came during the summit's second week when Ambassador Kira successfully convinced the Altarian delegation to support modified shared governance protocols. Marcus watched from his security position as she navigated complex negotiations that required understanding not just political positions but the cultural fears and historical grievances that drove them. The Altarians were convinced that joint administration meant surrendering their territorial sovereignty, she explained during their evening briefing. But when I showed them how shared governance could actually strengthen their defensive capabilities through coordinated resource management, they began to see cooperation as strategic advantage rather than weakness. That's impressive, Marcus said, reviewing the diplomatic progress reports while simultaneously monitoring intelligence updates about growing opposition to the peace process. How many delegations are supporting your framework now? 6 confirmed, with 2 more leaning toward agreement, Ambassador Kira replied, her satisfaction evident despite her diplomatic composure. If we can build consensus among 8 species, the remaining holdouts will face significant pressure to join rather than risk isolation. Marcus felt the tension between celebrating diplomatic success and worrying about how that success was increasing the danger to his primary responsibility. Ma'am, the more successful your negotiations become, the more desperate the opposition grows. The intelligence reports are showing increased coordination between extremist factions, which suggests we're close to achieving something they consider worth preventing, Ambassador Kira observed. That's actually encouraging from a diplomatic perspective. Less encouraging from a security perspective, Marcus muttered, pulling up threat assessments that painted an increasingly worrying picture. The opposition to the peace process was indeed organizing beyond official diplomatic channels. Intelligence intercepts revealed communications between military hardliners from the hegemony, commercial interests from the merchant coalition, and at least 3 extremist groups that viewed successful peace agreements as betrayal of their respective species' interests. They're not just opposing your proposals anymore, Marcus said, highlighting the concerning patterns in the intercepted communications. They're actively planning to disrupt the summit through direct action. Ambassador Kira studied the intelligence data with the kind of focused analysis that had made her such an effective negotiator. Direct action meaning they've moved beyond political opposition to considering physical intervention, Marcus replied grimly. The communications suggest coordinated planning for what they're calling decisive action to preserve essential interests. Assassination, she said simply. That's my assessment, yes ma'am. Ambassador Kira was quiet for several minutes, her amber eyes reflecting the complex calculations that Marcus had learned to associate with her decision-making process. Finally, she nodded with the kind of resigned determination that suggested she'd reached conclusions he probably wouldn't like. Specialist Vale, I understand the increased risks, but I need you to understand something about the timeline we're working with, she said, activating holographic displays that showed the summit's remaining schedule. We have exactly 1 week to finalize agreements before the various delegations return to their home systems for consultations that could take months. Ma'am. If we don't achieve consensus during this summit, the territorial disputes will likely escalate into military conflicts before we can reconvene, she continued. The hegemony has mobilization orders prepared, the merchant coalition is positioning defensive fleets, and at least 4 species have suspended trade agreements pending resolution of the territorial questions. Marcus studied the diplomatic timeline with growing understanding of why Ambassador Kira refused to let security concerns limit her activities. So this is the last chance for peaceful resolution. This is the last chance for any resolution that doesn't involve significant casualties across multiple star systems, she corrected. Which means I can't afford to withdraw from diplomatic engagement just because it's dangerous. The conversation established a working relationship that Marcus found both professionally satisfying and personally stressful. Ambassador Kira would continue her diplomatic schedule with minimal modifications, while Marcus would adapt security protocols to provide maximum protection within the constraints of her negotiating requirements. I need you to understand something, she said as they finalized the security arrangements. The shared governance proposal isn't just about preventing war, it's about demonstrating that cooperation between species is possible even when they have fundamental disagreements about resources and territory. You're trying to prove that diplomacy works, Marcus said. I'm trying to prove that trust works, she corrected. That beings from different worlds can find ways to benefit each other rather than just competing for advantage. Over the following days, Marcus developed genuine respect for Ambassador Kira's approach to the complex negotiations. She didn't just advocate for her own species' interests, she worked to understand what each delegation needed and then found creative ways to address those needs within frameworks that served everyone's long-term interests. The Satani are worried that shared governance will interfere with their migration routes through the contested systems, she explained during one of their security briefings that had evolved into informal diplomatic education sessions. Migration routes? Marcus asked. Their reproduction cycle requires access to specific stellar phenomena that occur in several of the disputed star systems, Ambassador Kira explained. They're not interested in mining rights or defensive positions, they just need guaranteed passage for their breeding ships every 7 years. So their opposition to shared governance is about biological necessity rather than political preference. Exactly. And once I understood that, I could propose administration frameworks that guarantee their access while still allowing other species to benefit from the system's resources. Her expression showed the kind of satisfaction that came from solving complex puzzles. The challenge is finding solutions that address everyone's actual needs rather than their stated positions. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by her analytical approach to seemingly impossible diplomatic challenges. But his admiration was tempered by growing intelligence about the threats that her success was generating. The extremist communications are becoming more specific, he reported during their 3rd week of negotiations. They're moving from general planning to operational details. What kind of operational details? Ambassador Kira asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer. Target identification, timing coordination, and asset positioning, Marcus replied. Ma'am, they're not just talking about disrupting the summit anymore. They're planning specific actions against specific individuals. Including me. You're the primary target, Marcus confirmed. Your role in building the coalition supporting shared governance has made you the symbol of everything they're trying to prevent. Ambassador Kira nodded with the kind of calm acceptance that suggested she'd been expecting this development. Specialist Vale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Yes, ma'am. If you were planning to prevent these peace negotiations from succeeding, what would be your most effective strategy? Marcus considered the question with the tactical analysis skills that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. Eliminate key diplomatic figures at critical moments to create chaos and mistrust that would derail the entire process. And the most critical moment would be during the final negotiations when the various delegations are closest to agreement, Marcus said, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. Maximum disruption for minimum effort. Which means the greatest danger will come precisely when we're closest to success, Ambassador Kira concluded. When we can least afford to let security concerns override diplomatic necessities. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on him like armor that was both protective and constraining. Ma'am, I can't protect you if you won't let me modify your schedule to account for increased threat levels. And I can't achieve peace if I let fear prevent me from completing the negotiations, she replied. Specialist Vale, we're both going to have to do our jobs under less than ideal circumstances. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, though his training was suggesting that less than ideal might be an optimistic assessment of what they were facing. The diplomatic breakthrough Marcus had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure came during the summit's 3rd week. Ambassador Kira had successfully built a coalition of 8 species supporting the shared governance framework, creating momentum that made final agreement seem genuinely possible for the first time since the negotiations began. The preliminary accord is remarkable, she said during their morning briefing, her satisfaction evident despite the diplomatic composure she maintained in formal settings. Joint administration of the contested star systems, with resources allocated based on contribution rather than political influence. Even the hegemony delegation is showing interest. Marcus reviewed the diplomatic progress reports while simultaneously monitoring overnight intelligence updates that painted an increasingly urgent picture. Ma'am, that's exactly what I was afraid you'd say. Afraid? The closer you get to successful peace agreements, the more desperate the opposition becomes, Marcus explained, highlighting threat assessments that had escalated significantly over the past 48 hours. The intercepts are showing coordinated planning between groups that have never cooperated before. Ambassador Kira studied the intelligence data with the focused attention she brought to all complex problems. Multiple extremist factions working together to prevent the peace process from succeeding. Multiple extremist factions planning direct action against the peace process, Marcus corrected. The communications have moved from general opposition to specific operational planning. The intelligence was indeed alarming. Military hardliners from the hegemony had established communication with commercial interests from the merchant coalition and at least 3 separatist groups that viewed any interspecies cooperation as a threat to their respective cultural identities. The combined opposition represented resources and capabilities that far exceeded what any single faction could muster. "They're calling it Operation Preservation," Marcus continued, "and the communications suggest they've moved beyond political resistance to planning what they termed decisive intervention to protect essential interests. Meaning they're planning to kill people," Ambassador Kira said with the kind of direct clarity that cut through diplomatic euphemisms. "Meaning they're planning to kill you specifically," Marcus replied. "The intercepts identify you as the primary architect of the shared governance proposal and the key figure holding the coalition together." Ambassador Kira was quiet for several minutes, her amber eyes reflecting the complex calculations that had made her such an effective negotiator. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of decisions that could affect millions of lives across multiple star systems. "Specialist Vale, I need you to understand something about where we are in this process," she said, activating displays that showed the negotiation timeline and remaining diplomatic schedule. "We have exactly 4 days to finalize agreements before the delegations return to their home systems for consultations that could take months to complete. Ma'am, I understand the time pressure, but if we don't achieve final consensus during this summit, the territorial disputes will escalate into military conflicts before we can reconvene," she continued. "The hegemony has prepared mobilization orders, the merchant coalition is positioning defensive fleets, and several species have already suspended trade agreements pending resolution of these issues." Marcus felt the familiar tension between his security responsibilities and his growing understanding of the broader implications of Ambassador Kira's work. "So this is the last opportunity for peaceful resolution." "This is the last opportunity for any resolution that doesn't involve significant casualties," she corrected. "Which means withdrawing from diplomatic engagement isn't just personally dangerous, it's strategically catastrophic." The weight of that assessment settled on Marcus like tactical gear that was both essential and constraining. He was being asked to protect someone whose survival might depend on maintaining a diplomatic schedule that made protection nearly impossible. "The final negotiations are scheduled for tomorrow," Ambassador Kira continued, highlighting the critical sessions where final agreements would either be achieved or abandoned. "Private consultations with neutral mediators, followed by formal ratification ceremonies if we can maintain consensus." "Private consultations," Marcus repeated, his tactical instincts immediately identifying the security vulnerabilities in such arrangements. "Essential for addressing the remaining concerns that could prevent final agreement," Ambassador Kira explained. "Several delegations have issues they can't discuss in formal sessions because of domestic political considerations." Marcus studied the proposed schedule with growing alarm. "Ma'am, private consultations with neutral mediators means moving you to locations outside the main diplomatic areas, with minimal security coverage, at precisely the moment when the extremist opposition is planning decisive intervention." "I understand the risks," she said simply. "I don't think you do," Marcus replied, his professional composure cracking slightly under the strain of trying to protect someone who seemed determined to make protection impossible. "The intelligence suggests coordinated assault teams with advanced weapons and inside knowledge of the station's layout. This isn't political opposition anymore, it's military action disguised as extremist activity." Ambassador Kira met his eyes with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "Specialist Vale, are you asking me to abandon the peace process to protect my personal safety?" The question hung in the air with the weight of everything they'd been working toward. Marcus realized that he was being asked to choose between his immediate responsibility for keeping one person alive and the broader responsibility for keeping millions of people from dying in conflicts that successful negotiations might prevent. "I'm asking you to let me modify the security arrangements to reduce your exposure during the most dangerous phase of the negotiations," he said finally. "And I'm telling you that modifying the arrangements changes their fundamental character in ways that would undermine their diplomatic effectiveness," she replied. "The neutral mediator's proposal works precisely because it removes the formal protocols that have been preventing honest discussion of the underlying issues. Marcus found himself caught between admiration for her commitment and frustration with her apparent willingness to sacrifice personal safety for diplomatic idealism. "Ma'am, what good does achieving peace do if you're not alive to see it implemented? What good does staying alive do if I fail to achieve peace and millions of people die in preventable conflicts?" she countered. The exchange established the parameters within which Marcus would have to operate for the next 4 days. Ambassador Kira would maintain her diplomatic schedule with minimal modifications, while Marcus would adapt security protocols to provide maximum protection within the constraints of her negotiating requirements. "I need you to understand something," she said as they finalized the arrangements. "The shared governance proposal isn't just about preventing this particular territorial war, it's about demonstrating that species can cooperate on complex issues even when they have fundamental disagreements about resources and sovereignty. You're trying to prove that diplomacy is a viable alternative to military action," Marcus said. "I'm trying to prove that trust is possible even between beings who have every reason to compete rather than cooperate," she corrected. "If these negotiations succeed, they become a template for resolving other territorial disputes without warfare. If they fail, other species conclude that military solutions are more reliable than diplomatic ones," Marcus finished. "Exactly. Which means this summit isn't just about preventing one war, it's about preventing a pattern of wars that could destabilize this entire sector of the galaxy." As Marcus prepared security protocols for what would likely be the most dangerous 4 days of his career, he found himself genuinely hoping that Ambassador Kira's faith in the possibility of peaceful cooperation would prove justified. But his tactical training was preparing for scenarios where faith alone wouldn't be sufficient to keep her alive long enough to discover whether peace was actually achievable. The intelligence reports continue to suggest that Operation Preservation was entering its final implementation phase, with assets positioning themselves for coordinated action during the private consultations that would either finalize the peace agreements or provide the perfect opportunity to eliminate the diplomat who had made them possible. The ambush came exactly when and where Marcus's worst-case scenarios had predicted. The corridor leading to the private consultation with neutral mediators was supposedly one of the most secure areas on Concordia Station, but security meant nothing when the attack came from trusted personnel with legitimate access codes and intimate knowledge of protective protocols. "Movement ahead," Marcus reported into his comm, noting the figures that had emerged from service alcoves that should have been empty. "Multiple contacts, armed, blocking our route to." The energy weapons opened fire before he could complete the warning. Marcus reacted with the instincts developed through years of combat experience, his body moving to shield Ambassador Kira before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. The first salvo of energy blasts burned through the air where she had been standing, striking the corridor walls with enough force to melt crystalline decorations into slag. "Get down!" he shouted, pushing Ambassador Kira toward the limited cover provided by a structural support column while drawing his sidearm and returning fire toward the attackers. The firefight was brief but vicious. The assault team had positioned themselves with tactical precision, creating crossfire zones that made movement dangerous while maintaining clear lines of sight toward their primary target. Marcus counted at least 6 attackers, all equipped with military-grade energy weapons and wearing armor that suggested professional training rather than extremist improvisation. "This is Vale, emergency protocol," he transmitted, hoping that station security would respond before the attackers could complete their mission. "Ambassador Kira under direct assault, Section 7 Alpha, need immediate backup." An energy blast caught him in the chest, the impact spinning him against the corridor wall as his body armor absorbed most of the damage. But the weapons were designed to overwhelm personal protection, and Marcus felt the burning sensation that indicated his defensive systems were failing under repeated hits. Another blast seared across his left arm, penetrating his armor entirely and leaving a wound that filled the corridor with the smell of burned flesh and synthetic materials. Marcus gritted his teeth against the pain while maintaining suppressing fire toward the attackers, determined to keep them focused on him rather than on Ambassador Kira. "Marcus," he heard her call, though her voice seemed to come from a great distance despite being only meters away. "Stay down," he managed to reply, though speaking required effort that he could barely spare from the immediate tactical situation. The turning point came when station security finally responded in force, their arrival announced by the distinctive whine of heavy-energy weapons that could cut through military-grade armor. The attackers found themselves caught between Marcus's defensive position and the security teams approaching from their rear, a tactical situation that left them with no viable escape routes. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun, with the surviving attackers surrendering rather than facing certain elimination by overwhelming firepower. Marcus slumped against the corridor wall, his vision graying at the edges as shock and blood loss combined to make consciousness increasingly difficult to maintain. Medic. Ambassador Kira's voice carried the kind of authority that made people respond without question. Emergency medical team to Section 7 Alpha immediately. Marcus tried to focus on her face as she knelt beside him, her amber eyes reflecting concern that seemed purely personal rather than diplomatic. "Are you?" he began, then stopped as speaking became too much effort. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "You shielded me from the worst of it. The medics are coming, just hold on." Marcus felt himself drifting as emergency medical teams swarmed into the corridor, their equipment and procedures becoming a distant blur of activity that he couldn't quite follow. He was dimly aware of being transferred to a mobile medical unit, of Ambassador Kira's voice giving instructions to the medical personnel, of movement through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. But what penetrated through the fog of pain, medication and shock was the moment when Ambassador Kira did something that would be remembered in both human and Zephyrian diplomatic history. Standing in the medical bay as human and Zephyrian medical teams worked to stabilize Marcus's condition, she reached up and tore the ceremonial crest from her diplomatic robes, a symbol of her authority that was woven into the fabric itself and could only be removed through deliberate destruction of the garment. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled medical staff and the diplomatic observers who had followed the emergency to the treatment facility. The ceremonial crest represented not just Ambassador Kira's personal authority but her family's honor and her species' commitment to the diplomatic mission. "Ambassador," protested the senior Zephyrian medical officer, "the crest cannot be." "The crest is mine to give," she interrupted with absolute authority, placing the torn symbol over Marcus's unconscious form with movements that carried the weight of ancient ritual. "I invoke the protection of House Velthani for Marcus Vale, who bled in defense of my life and the peace we serve together." The invocation of traditional protection protocols sent diplomatic observers scrambling for their communication devices while medical personnel tried to understand the legal implications of what they'd witnessed. According to Zephyrian law, the ceremonial crest extended tribal protection to non-family members only under the most extraordinary circumstances, and never to beings from other species. "Ambassador Kira," said the human diplomatic liaison, clearly struggling to process the unprecedented situation, "the protocols for extending Zephyrian protection to human personnel are complex and may require approval from multiple governmental authorities. Marcus Vale is under my protection now," she said with finality that cut through all bureaucratic concerns. "Anyone who questions that will answer to me personally, and to the House Velthani, and to every Zephyrian who understands that honor demands recognition of sacrifice freely given." The statement established legal protection that superseded normal diplomatic protocols while creating political complications that would require months to fully resolve. But it also ensured that Marcus would receive the best possible medical care from both human and Zephyrian medical technologies, with resources that might mean the difference between recovery and permanent disability. "He shielded me without hesitation," Ambassador Kira continued, her voice carrying the emotional weight that formal diplomatic language usually concealed. "He took wounds that were meant for me, risked his life for someone he's known for only 3 weeks, asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to do his job properly." She looked around the medical bay at the assembled staff and observers, her amber eyes reflecting the kind of determination that had made her such an effective negotiator. "If that doesn't merit the protection of my house, then our concepts of honor are meaningless." The medical teams worked through the night, combining human trauma surgery with Zephyrian healing techniques that accelerated cellular regeneration and reduced long-term damage from energy weapon burns. The ceremonial crest that Ambassador Kira had placed over Marcus provided not just legal protection but access to medical resources that neither species could have provided independently. 3 days later, Marcus woke up in a medical facility that represented unprecedented cooperation between human and Zephyrian medical science. His injuries were healing faster than should have been possible, and the pain that he'd expected to be overwhelming was managed by therapeutic techniques that seemed to work on levels his human physiology didn't entirely understand. "You're awake," Ambassador Kira said, rising from a chair beside his medical bed. She looked exhausted but relieved, wearing simple clothing rather than her formal diplomatic robes. "Did we?" Marcus began, his voice rough from the medical procedures. "The peace accords were signed yesterday," she said with obvious satisfaction. 8 species committed to the shared governance framework, with implementation beginning immediately. The attack actually strengthened support for the agreements. Several delegations decided that if extremists were willing to commit violence to prevent peace, then peace must be worth achieving. Marcus felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by questions about the implications of what he remembered happening in the medical bay. "Ambassador, the ceremonial crest, what you did." "What I did was recognize that some actions transcend political calculations," she replied simply. "You risked your life to protect mine, not because of diplomatic protocol or alliance obligations, but because you believed the peace process was worth defending." "And the legal complications?" Ambassador Kira smiled with the expression Marcus had learned to associate with successful navigation of complex diplomatic challenges. "Both our governments have decided that unprecedented cooperation in medical care represents exactly the kind of interspecies collaboration that the peace accords are designed to encourage. So I'm officially under Zephyrian protection." "You're officially the first human to receive tribal protection from House Velthani," she confirmed. "Which means you have legal standing in Zephyrian space, access to our medical facilities, and the right to call upon our house for assistance if circumstances require it." Marcus tried to process the magnitude of what she'd done. "Ambassador, you violated multiple diplomatic protocols and possibly several laws to protect someone you barely know." "I protected someone who demonstrated that the principles we've been negotiating. Cooperation, mutual sacrifice, shared commitment to something larger than individual interest, actually work when people choose to live by them rather than just talk about them." Her expression grew more serious. "Marcus, what you did during that attack proved that beings from different worlds can trust each other completely, even at significant personal cost." "I was just doing my job." "You were doing much more than your job," she corrected. "You were demonstrating the kind of personal commitment that makes lasting peace possible." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the Zephyrian embassy on Arcturus Prime, watching as the joint administration councils took their first votes on resource allocation for the shared governance systems. The framework that Ambassador Kira had negotiated was working better than anyone had dared hope, with former competitors now collaborating on projects that benefited all participating species. "The quarterly reports are encouraging," Ambassador Kira said, joining him at the observation windows with data tablets showing cooperation statistics that exceeded all projections. "Even the groups that initially opposed shared governance are discovering advantages they hadn't anticipated." "Think it will last?" Marcus asked, noting the ceremonial crest of House Velthani that now hung in the embassy's main reception area, a replacement for the one she'd torn from her robes to protect him. "It will last as long as people remember that peace requires personal commitment as well as political agreements," she replied. "As long as individuals are willing to risk something for each other rather than just calculating advantages." Marcus smiled, understanding that their relationship had evolved far beyond professional necessity into something that neither of them had expected but both genuinely valued. "Speaking of personal commitment, how do you feel about dinner?" "I've been wanting to try that Zephyrian restaurant in the embassy district." "I'd like that," Ambassador Kira said, her expression brightening. "Though I should warn you, traditional Zephyrian cuisine includes dishes that are designed to test your commitment to interspecies cooperation." "After everything we've been through," Marcus replied, "I think I can handle whatever challenge your people's food can present." As they left the embassy together, Marcus reflected that some of the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happened not in formal negotiations but in quiet moments when people chose to protect each other regardless of personal cost. The ceremonial crest that had saved his life had become a symbol of the kind of trust that made lasting peace possible, proof that cooperation between species could survive even the most violent opposition when it was built on genuine care for each other's welfare. The shared governance accords continue to serve as a template for peaceful resolution of territorial disputes throughout the galaxy, but Marcus knew that their real success lay in demonstrating that personal relationships could transcend political boundaries when people were willing to bleed for each other's dreams of a better future.